Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to go back about half a year, a little over actually, to when experienced Conservative MPs were sounding notes of optimism about their immediate future under Rishi Sunak, what they said needed to happen, and why it's all turned to ashes again as Labour's poll lead has remained exactly where it was. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel. So this isn't the first video where I've reviewed Rishi Sunak's progress. I don't think it'll be the last. But I was bobbing about in old articles and I found one in The Guardian from February where it was quoting senior Conservatives, like experienced Conservative MPs, as being optimistic and how they thought Rishi Sunak would revive their fortunes. Now, being clear, they weren't trying to make the case, oh yeah, we could win the election. They just thought that Rishi Sunak would put them in a position where they at least had a chance. That's what they wanted. They just wanted a chance. At the time, Sunak appeared to have dealt with phase one, which was getting the public to move on from the heady days of the lettuce wars with Liz Truss. Sunak had made 5 pledges by which to judge him, which were, at the time, considered so laughably simple to deliver that no further discussion was needed. And experienced Conservative MPs were charting a path back towards electoral credibility with moves such as dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol, facing down opposition on the extreme wing of the party, which Sunak did, but also coming to agreement with striking public sector workers, presenting a budget which did not look like reheated austerity, and with better decision making in general. Oh dear. At the time, according to YouGov, Labour were 23 points ahead of Sunak, Tories in the polls. Now they're 22 points ahead. And in point of fact, never mind the arbitrary snapshots, the long-term gap has basically not moved this year. Across all polls, Labour have maintained a gap of almost exactly 20 points all year. So what went wrong? Well, although the Conservatives knew back in February that they would need a bit of luck in terms of a better economic outlook, they mentioned very specific things that Sunak could do. So let's see how Sunak did. First, that he puts the Northern Ireland Protocol to bed and faced down the much diminished opposition on the extreme wing of the Conservative Party. This was absolutely essential for 2 reasons. First of all, even very Eurosceptic Tory MPs were now sick of the pointless wrangling. They wanted us to leave the EU. We left the EU. They didn't want ongoing arguments distracting from the main business of government. Second, without agreement, we were heading into a trade war with the EU, which we could not possibly hope to emerge from without being badly beaten up. We were already, and still are, already not applying trade barriers to EU imports for fear of inflation and shortages. So the idea that we can engage in a trade war, which involves more trade friction, was ludicrous. They needed a settlement, and to be fair, Sunak got it. He not only got agreement with the EU, he faced down the rebels in his party as well. The strong showing of support for his rebranded Windsor framework was a sign that the vast majority of Tory MPs wanted to move on from the acrimony. But this is where Sunak's success began and ended. If we look at the other elements cited in February, it's less rosy. So they said he needed to present a budget that was less austere. We didn't get it. Worse than that, in recent weeks, the full scale of Sunak's austerity decision has been laid bare. He's directly implicated in the decisions not to go ahead with urgent building programmes for schools and hospitals. Regardless of what image Sunak hoped to present with his first budget as Prime Minister, what we got is the overwhelming impression of false economy, penny pinching, which is now resulting in public services literally collapsing. And it's not just the big stuff. People feel that their finances are continuing to be squeezed as well. Sunak needed to at least engineer a feel-good factor, the impression of things getting better, even if it was just until the election, after which he'd put the squeeze back on. But he couldn't even do that. His plan is now to squeeze benefits in order to find a tax cut for next year's pre-election budget. Won't work because it will make most voters worse off. It does traditionally work, but that's because they do it at times when things are sort of fine, and target voters at least aren't noticing that they're worse off overall after Tory tax cuts, because they can still afford their expected standard of living. People don't actually do the maths on their finances in a new tax year. They don't actually work out if they're better off or not. If as long as they can afford the things they sort of want to afford, they sort of assume things are going all right. But people are cutting back now. Lots of people. I don't just mean people in the lower deciles. Target voters are cutting back. And when they are already cutting back, you won't fool them into thinking a tax cut is putting more money into their pockets if they're still cutting back next year after the budget. Another reason cited for being positive was inflation falling, with the hope that interest rates would as well. That was specifically cited. With inflation falling, we may get to a point where interest rates are falling. Well, inflation is falling. It's fallen more slowly than expected. And although interest rates may not go up as high as originally feared, they're not coming down. In fact, the buzz is that interest rates are going up again this week. This means that the Tories are still having to contend with more mortgage holders finding their repayments increasing by hundreds of pounds. Every month, a new tranche of mortgage holders is coming off their fixed rate and then finding that their repayments are going up massively. To say nothing of the impact on people renting properties on which their landlord has a mortgage or just thinks they can get away with it. Conservatives cited sensible settlements with public sector workers, including doctors. This did not occur. In fact, Sunak continued his predecessor's policies of not even attempting to negotiate, the result of which is that his claim to reduce NHS waiting lists is now in tatters because it's actually gone up by another 500,000, never mind down, and he's left blaming the state of the NHS on doctors now. As for getting better general decision making than occurred under the famously chaotic Boris Johnson, even that hasn't happened. Sunak may be a harder worker than Johnson, but his methods are largely the same. He has surrounded himself with yes men when what he needs are basically, plain speaking, Yorkshire folk to tell him exactly where he's going wrong and telling him that he needs to take responsibility instead of just looking to blame others. The blame game is every bit as ridiculous under Sunak as it was under Johnson. There was a time when Tories made national enemies of the poor or the disabled or good old-fashioned foreigners. But the hole they've dug for themselves now is so deep that they've resorted to blaming Middle England for the ills of the country. The RSPB, the National Trust, the proms now at the Albert Hall. You get away with blaming small groups of the disenfranchised who don't vote for you anyway. But the Tories are on much thinner ice when they're basically blaming their own voters. It's got to the point where there's hardly anyone left to blame, unless they fancy having a pop at the King next. But what this 7-month-old article makes clear, it's not just the extent to which Sunak has failed to make any impression on Tory polling, but just what some Conservative MPs thought they'd be getting from him compared to what they actually got. Because I have to say, if he'd actually done what they were calling for back in February, there is every chance he would have put the Conservative Party on a better footing. He'd be more secure as leader now because he'd be able to show progress. I don't think he'd be in contention still, but he'd be able to show progress and it would have strengthened his position as leader. The national infrastructure that's been neglected for far too long, he wouldn't be able to engineer any economic miracles. The problem with collapsing public buildings, that would still be happening because that was a long time in the making. But he could have put an end to the damaging strikes. He could have moved away from the childish culture wars and given the public the impression he was actually interested in their problems. He could have put his government on a trajectory of improving the country. Instead, he reverted to blame whilst the country continued to collapse. I've even commented recently that his PMQ's performances are now just a carbon copy of the way Boris Johnson used to conduct himself. Even the obvious lies are just as brazen and ill thought out. Rishi Sunak has just become a sort of sober version of Boris Johnson. He seems completely oblivious to the fact that Johnson was losing safe by-elections before the scandals blew up. It wasn't always about the scandals. That's finished him off. Before Partygate, before even Owen Paterson, Boris Johnson was losing the safe Tory seat of Chesham and Amersham because traditional Conservative voters did not support his policies in government. Sunak doesn't even have policies. He claims he does. He claims he's small state, low tax Thatcherite. But what he's delivering is collapsing state and high tax. There is no part of the political spectrum that wants that. When you look back at what experienced Conservative MPs expected Sunak to do over half a year ago and what has subsequently happened, you might be scratching your head. It's like, well, there was a plan. What happened? I would say they failed to take account of Sunak's complete lack of backbone. You have to be a little bit circumspect in politics, of course. You can't just be saying, oh, you should face down the rebels. If the rebels are too strong, of course you can't. You know, you can't always do things, even if they're the right things, if you don't have support. Impossible. Politics is all about support. But Sunak had the chance to get all the support he needed. Like, give you an example. It was one thing to face down rebels over the Windsor framework. He had to do that. There was no choice. But it's like, if you give him an escape pod, he uses it every time. When the next time came down to face the rebels, it was actually even easier. But he ran away. As Boris Johnson's Privileges Committee investigation was getting to the spicy endgame, Sunak issued an instruction that his MPs should not impugn the committee. What happened? Several did, and he did nothing about it. The first to stick their head above the parapet should have had the whip withdrawn. I told you, I gave you fair warning. If another one or two did likewise, same treatment for them. What does it matter? I mean, who would this have affected? Nadine Dorries is not an MP now anyway. Jacob Rees-Mogg, no great loss. You know, there were only 2 or 3 that would have done it anyway, even with the whip being withdrawn. The rest would have kept quiet. If Sunak had acted as he should, not only would he have brought the majority of those rebels into line, but he'd have looked like a leader. He would have looked like he was taking a stand. It would have had public approval. And what's more, it's what the vast majority of his MPs wanted him to do. And it would have been easy. No cost, no political cost to doing this. Instead, he ignored them. Then he stayed away from Parliament when the report was being debated. And this gives you an insight into all of the other failures, which mean that Sunak is over half a year further forward and still sitting on the same polling deficit. Even when he's got enough support to do something, he cannot deal with the confrontation with a tiny number who would oppose him, unless he's trapped into it, unless he's forced into it. And Windsor framework aside, he's always had the option of not confronting things. For everything else he was supposed to do, he's always had the option of running away. So he has done. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.